In the sterile silence of room 314, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights that never sleep, a specialist physician stood with a medical chart clutched in his hands. His face, weathered by years of delivering both miracles and heartbreak, had settled into an expression of clinical finality. The machines surrounding the small hospital bed beeped in their mechanical rhythm, each sound marking another moment in a battle that medicine was losing. The doctor turned to face the couple standing by the window. Mark and Sarah had been holding vigil for 72 hours straight, their bodies exhausted, their hearts already beginning the impossible work of letting go. The doctor cleared his throat, that universal signal that difficult words were coming. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice professionally gentle but firm, "we've done everything within the power of modern medicine. Every treatment protocol, every intervention available to us. I'm truly sorry, but there's no hope. Your daughter's organs are shutting down. It's time to say goodbye." The words hung in the air like a death sentence already executed. Sarah's knees buckled, and she collapsed into the chair beside her daughter's bed, her hand reaching out to grasp the small, pale fingers that lay motionless on the white sheets. Mark stood frozen, his face contorting as he fought against the reality that was crushing down on him like an avalanche of grief. As the doctor quietly exited the room, leaving the family to their final moments, something changed in the atmosphere. The door opened again so gently that it made no sound. An elderly woman in standard nursing scrubs entered, her movements unhurried, her presence somehow filling the room with a quality that defied description. This was Grace, a nurse whose name appeared on no official roster, whose face would later be found in no hospital database. She didn't speak. She didn't offer the empty platitudes that so many well-meaning people deliver in moments of unspeakable loss. She simply moved to the side of the bed and began her work with a quiet dignity that seemed to emanate peace into the room of despair. But before we continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. What would you do when science and reason tell you all hope is lost? Where do you turn when the experts say there's nothing left to try? I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts. And please, let us know which city you're watching from right now. If you believe that miracles can happen in the quietest moments, in the most unexpected ways, then subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of this story to understand how the Thompson family arrived at this moment of ultimate crisis. Mark Thompson had been a successful journalist for the New York Tribune, the kind of reporter who built his career on facts, evidence, and exposing the truth behind comfortable lies. He approached the world with a skeptic's eye, always questioning, never accepting anything on faith alone. His wife Sarah had been a high school art teacher, someone who saw beauty in the world and tried to cultivate it in her students. Together, they had created a life that felt blessed, culminating in the birth of their daughter Lily 7 years earlier. Lily had been a child of pure light from the moment she entered the world. She had her mother's creative spirit and her father's curious mind. She asked questions about everything, painted pictures of imaginary worlds, and had a laugh that could turn the greyest day into something worth celebrating. She was the kind of child who noticed when someone was sad and would offer them her favorite toy without being asked. She was, in every way, the embodiment of hope and innocence. The first sign that something was wrong came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Lily complained of a headache at breakfast. Sarah gave her children's pain reliever and sent her to school, thinking nothing of it. By lunchtime, the school nurse was calling to say that Lily had collapsed during recess. The ambulance ride to St. Catherine's Children's Hospital was the beginning of a nightmare that would test the very foundations of everything Mark and Sarah believed about the world. The diagnosis came after 3 days of tests. A rare, aggressive form of childhood leukemia, complicated by a secondary infection that her compromised immune system couldn't fight. The doctors spoke in percentages and protocols, in clinical terms that tried to soften the brutal reality. They used words like aggressive treatment and fighting chance, but Mark, trained to read between the lines, heard what they weren't saying directly. The next 6 months became a blur of chemotherapy sessions, blood transfusions, experimental treatments, and steadily declining hope. Lily, with the resilience that children somehow possess, tried to stay brave. She wore colorful scarves when her hair fell out. She made jokes with the nurses. She drew pictures of herself as a superhero fighting the bad guys in her blood, but as the treatments continued and her small body weakened, even her incredible spirit began to dim. Mark watched his daughter fade, and with her his faith in anything beyond the material world crumbled. He had never been particularly religious, but he had believed in a basic fairness to the universe. Good people, he thought, got good outcomes if they worked hard enough. But what had Lily done to deserve this? What cosmic justice allowed a 7-year-old girl to suffer while the world's truly evil people prospered? He became angry, bitter, cynical. He stopped talking to the few friends who tried to offer prayers or spiritual comfort. He threw himself into researching every possible medical treatment, as if sheer determination and information could save his daughter where faith could not. Sarah, by contrast, became quieter. She spent hours sitting beside Lily's bed reading stories, singing soft songs, holding her daughter's hand. She prayed, though she wasn't sure to whom or what. She lit candles in the hospital chapel when Mark wasn't looking. She clung to hope the way a drowning person clings to driftwood, knowing it might not be enough, but unable to let go. The hospital itself was a monument to human achievement in medical science. St. Catherine's Children's Hospital was ranked among the top pediatric facilities in the nation. Its gleaming corridors housed the most advanced diagnostic equipment money could buy. Its staff included specialists who had trained at the finest institutions in the world. Parents brought their children here from across the country, placing their faith in science, in knowledge, in the accumulated wisdom of modern medicine. But for all its technological marvels, St. Catherine's was a cold place. The walls were painted in colors that psychological studies had determined were calming, but no amount of soft blue and gentle green could warm the institutional atmosphere. The art on the walls, carefully chosen to be child-friendly and uplifting, seemed to mock the families walking past on their way to receive devastating news. The whole place felt like a temple to human capability, and yet here, in its most advanced wing, children still died. Grace had been working at St. Catherine's for an indeterminate amount of time. If you asked the other nurses, some would say she had been there for years. Others would insist they had only just met her. No one seemed to know much about her personal life. She worked the overnight shifts mostly, appearing and disappearing with such quiet efficiency that she rarely drew attention to herself. While other nurses chatted at the stations, sharing stories about their families and their lives outside the hospital, Grace moved through the corridors like a gentle whisper, there and then, not there, always exactly where she was needed but never in the way. She was older, perhaps in her late 60s or early 70s, though her age was hard to pinpoint. Her face bore the lines of someone who had lived a full life, but her eyes held a quality of timelessness. Her hands, when she checked vitals or adjusted IV lines, moved with a practiced gentleness that spoke of decades of experience. She never rushed. She never seemed tired. And when she entered a room, something about the atmosphere would shift, though most people couldn't quite articulate what changed. On the night that everything came to its crisis point, Grace had been checking on Lily every hour. She would slip into room 314, note the readings on the monitors, adjust a blanket, ensure the IV was flowing properly, and then slip out again. Mark barely noticed her. Sarah would sometimes look up and nod in acknowledgement, receiving a gentle smile in return, but no words were exchanged. They were part of the background machinery of hospital life, the workers who kept the institution running while the doctors made the important decisions. But then came the moment when the head of pediatric oncology, Dr. Richard Brennan, entered the room with his final verdict. Dr. Brennan was a good man who had gone into medicine with the purest of intentions. He had saved countless children over his career. He had celebrated with families when remissions came, when tumors shrank, when blood counts returned to normal. But he had also delivered this same speech too many times, and each time it took something from him. He stood at the foot of Lily's bed, the medical chart in his hands containing the undeniable evidence of her body's failure. Her kidneys were shutting down. Her liver was compromised. Her heart was weakening. The infections were spreading despite the most powerful antibiotics. There was nothing left to try. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, and they both knew from his tone what was coming. "We've exhausted every option. The treatments aren't working. Her body is shutting down. I need you to understand that there is nothing more we can do. Your daughter is dying, and fighting against it now is only prolonging her suffering. It's time to remove the life support and let her go peacefully." "I'm so very sorry." Mark's response was immediate and visceral. He lunged forward, not at the doctor but at the wall, slamming his fist into it with such force that his knuckles split. The pain was welcome, a physical sensation to anchor him against the psychological torment. "How can you say that?" he roared. How can you just give up? You're supposed to save her, that's your job. All these machines, all this technology, all these specialists, and you're telling me there's nothing? Nothing? Dr. Brennan stood his ground with the patience of someone who had weathered many such storms of grief. I understand your anger, Mr. Thompson. I wish I could tell you something different. But keeping her on these machines now is not saving her life. It's preventing her death, and those are not the same thing. I need you to think about what's best for Lily, not what's easiest for us. Sarah's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. How long? Hours, the doctor replied. Maybe a day at most. Her heart will give out soon. You should call anyone who wants to say goodbye. When Dr. Brennan left the room, the silence that remained was suffocating. Mark stood with his back to his wife and daughter, staring at his bleeding knuckles, his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. Sarah sat in the chair, her hand still clutching Lily's, tears streaming down her face in an endless river of grief. That's when Grace entered again. She had her small cart with her, the one that held fresh linens and basic supplies. She moved to the sink to wash her hands, and the sound of running water was strangely soothing in the heavy atmosphere of despair. Mark turned on her, his rage needing a target. Just leave us alone, he said, his voice harsh. We don't need anyone checking vitals or changing sheets, just get out. But before Grace could respond, Sarah spoke up. Her voice was desperate, pleading. No, please, will you stay with us for a moment? Please, I can't be alone with this right now. It was this invitation, this choice in a moment of ultimate darkness, that opened the door to what would follow. Grace nodded quietly and moved to the side of Lily's bed. She looked down at the small figure surrounded by tubes and wires, at the pale face that had once been so full of life and light. She has a beautiful spirit, Grace said softly. It was the first substantial thing she had said to them in all the weeks they had been there. The words weren't offered as comfort or platitude. They were stated as a simple fact, the way someone might observe that the sky is blue or water is wet. As Grace reached out to straighten the blanket that had bunched up around Lily's thin shoulders, something inexplicable happened. The heart monitor, which had been maintaining its erratic, concerning rhythm, suddenly smoothed out. For perhaps 10 seconds, the beeps became perfectly regular, perfectly calm, a sound of health and normalcy that hadn't been heard from that machine in months. Then, just as suddenly, it returned to its irregular pattern. Sarah gasped. Did you see that? Did you hear that? Mark frowned at the monitor. It was just a glitch. These machines malfunction sometimes. But Sarah wasn't listening to her husband. She was looking at Grace with sudden, desperate attention. Tell me something, she said. Please. Tell me anything that isn't what the doctors are saying. Tell me there's something more than just this ending. Grace pulled up a chair and sat down beside Sarah. Her presence was extraordinary in its ordinariness. She didn't glow. There were no visible signs of anything supernatural or divine. She was simply an elderly nurse with kind eyes and weathered hands, giving a few moments of her time to a heartbroken mother. Tell me about her, Grace said. Tell me about Lily when she's being herself. And Sarah did. Once she started talking, the stories poured out. She told Grace about the time Lily had found a wounded bird in the backyard and insisted on nursing it back to health, crying when it died, but then declaring that at least it hadn't died alone. She talked about Lily's paintings, how she would mix colors in ways that shouldn't work, but somehow created something beautiful. She described how Lily would dance in the kitchen while Sarah cooked dinner, making up songs about vegetables and turning meal preparation into a performance. Mark listened from his position by the window, his arms crossed, his face a mask of pain. But despite himself, he felt something shift as Sarah talked. These stories were Lily's real life, not the medical drama of the last 6 months. This was who their daughter actually was, beyond the patient in the bed, beyond the chart of declining numbers. Grace listened with an intensity that made Sarah feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time since this nightmare began. The nurse didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice, didn't try to find silver linings or lessons in the suffering. She simply received Sarah's words as if they were precious gifts. When Sarah finally ran out of words, exhausted by the emotional outpouring, Grace spoke again. Sometimes, she said, the greatest light is found in the deepest darkness. Not because the darkness is good, but because only in complete darkness can we see even the smallest light at all. Mark scoffed from his position by the window. What's that supposed to mean? Some kind of fortune cookie philosophy? My daughter is dying, and you're giving us riddles. Grace stood up, unfazed by his hostility. I'm saying that what you can see isn't always all there is to see. I'm saying that the end of one thing might be the beginning of something else. I'm saying that hope isn't always reasonable, but that doesn't make it foolish." She moved toward the door, her task completed. "I'll check on her again soon," she said, and then she was gone, leaving behind a subtle sense that something important had just occurred, though neither parent could have explained what it was. Over the next few hours, as afternoon gave way to evening and evening to night, Lily's condition continued to deteriorate. The nurses came and went, noting the declining numbers with grim faces. Sarah called her mother and Mark's father, asking them to come say goodbye. They called Lily's teacher, who arrived with cards from her classmates, each one decorated with hearts and rainbows and messages like, "We miss you," and "Get well soon," words that now felt like mockery. Mark made the call he had been dreading to his editor, telling her he wouldn't be back to work, probably ever. How could he go back to writing about political scandals and corporate corruption when his daughter was dying? How could anything he had spent his career on possibly matter in the face of this? Sarah sat by the bed, holding Lily's hand, singing lullabies in a broken voice. She sang "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" and "You Are My Sunshine" and "Amazing Grace," the old hymn she had learned as a child in a church she hadn't attended in years. She prayed between songs, formless prayers that were more feeling than words, desperately reaching out to any power that might be listening. Around midnight, when the hospital had settled into its nighttime quiet, Lily's grandmother and grandfather arrived. They stood beside the bed, these people who had watched their granddaughter grow from an infant into this bright, creative child, and they wept. They held Sarah and Mark. They whispered their own goodbyes to Lily, even though she couldn't hear them, telling her they loved her and that it was okay to let go if she was tired. Grace appeared again around 2 in the morning. She came in so quietly that they didn't notice her at first. She moved around the room, checking things, her presence somehow making the space feel less like a place of dying and more like a place of transition. "You should rest," she said to Sarah, who looked like she might collapse from exhaustion. "Even for a few minutes. You need your strength." "I can't leave her," Sarah said. "What if she wakes up and I'm not here? What if she's scared and I'm not holding her hand?" "She knows you're here," Grace said with quiet certainty. "She knows she's loved. That knowledge doesn't disappear just because you step out of the room for 10 minutes to drink some water and breathe fresh air." Mark, who had been dozing fitfully in the chair by the window, stirred at the voices. He looked at the nurse with bloodshot eyes. "You're still here? Don't you have other patients?" "I'm where I need to be," Grace replied simply. As dawn approached, something began to change in Lily's readings. The night shift doctor was called in to check the monitors. He examined her, his face growing more concerned. The intervals between her breaths were lengthening. Her heart rate was becoming more erratic. Her blood pressure was dropping. "It's happening," he told the family quietly. "I'm going to call Dr. Brennan. You should prepare yourselves." By 7 in the morning, the room had filled with medical staff. Dr. Brennan arrived looking tired, having been up most of the night with another critical case. He examined Lily thoroughly, checking the monitors, reading the latest lab results that had been rushed through. His face told the story before his words did. "Her organs are failing," he said to Mark and Sarah. "Her heart is barely functioning. The machines are doing almost all the work of keeping her alive now. I need you to make a decision. Do you want us to attempt resuscitation when her heart stops? Do you want to intubate her further to keep her breathing artificially? Or do you want to let her go peacefully when the time comes?" Mark and Sarah looked at each other across their daughter's bed. This was the moment they had been dreading, the impossible decision that no parent should ever have to make. "How long?" Mark asked, his voice hollow. "Minutes to hours," Dr. Brennan replied honestly. "I can't be more specific than that." Sarah looked down at Lily's face. Her daughter looked so small, so fragile, so unlike the vibrant child who had danced in the kitchen just 7 months ago. "No more machines," she whispered. "No more needles. No more pain. Just let her be comfortable." "Doctor." Brennan nodded. "I'll have the team prepare comfort care measures. I'm truly sorry. I wish medicine had more to offer." As the medical team began making their preparations, adjusting medications to ensure Lily wouldn't suffer, turning off alarms, Sarah noticed Grace standing in the corner of the room. The elderly nurse wasn't doing anything, wasn't checking equipment or making notes. She was simply present, her eyes filled with a compassion so profound that Sarah felt it like a physical force. "Please," Sarah whispered, looking at Grace. She didn't know what she was asking for. A miracle, comfort, witness, all of it. None of it. Then it happened. The crisis that would change everything came without warning, as these things often do. Lily's heart monitor began to race, the beeps coming faster and faster until they blurred into a continuous whine. Her body convulsed once, a violent spasm that made the bed shake. Alarms erupted throughout the room. "She's crashing," one of the nurses shouted. Dr. Brennan rushed to the bedside, his hands moving quickly, checking responses, reading monitors. "V-fib," someone called out. "She's in ventricular fibrillation." "Get the crash cart," Dr. Brennan ordered, his training taking over even as he knew the family had opted for comfort care only. "Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Thompson, her heart is failing. This is it. Do you want us to try to bring her back, or do you want us to let her go peacefully?" Mark stood frozen, his face a mask of agony. He looked at his daughter's body, jerking against the seizure, at the medical team poised to intervene, at his wife's face contorted with grief. He thought about all the months of suffering, all the treatments that had only prolonged the inevitable. He thought about Lily's drawing of herself as a superhero, now pinned to the wall above her bed, and how even superheroes sometimes lost their battles. "Let her go," he said, the words tearing out of him. "Please, no more. Just let her go." But Sarah was not done fighting. She remembered Grace's words. Sometimes the greatest light is found in the deepest darkness. She remembered the moment when the heart monitor had smoothed out, when Grace touched Lily's blanket. She remembered a faith she had thought she'd lost, a belief that some things couldn't be explained by medical charts and statistics. "No," Sarah screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos of the room. "Not yet. Please, not yet." She scanned the room desperately and found Grace still standing in the corner. Their eyes met across the crowded space, across all the medical equipment and the rushing staff and the reality of death closing in. Sarah didn't have words for what she needed. She couldn't articulate a specific request or formulate a coherent prayer, so she simply looked at Grace and mouthed one word: "Please." The heart monitor flatlined. The continuous tone that signals the cessation of life filled the room, that sound that haunts hospital dramas and real families alike. Dr. Brennan looked at his watch, preparing to note the time. "Time of death," he began to say, but Grace was already moving. She walked through the chaos with a serenity that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The medical staff, absorbed in their protocols and their grief, didn't try to stop her. Some of them would later say they didn't even see her move. She simply appeared beside Lily's bed, as if she had always been standing there. She didn't look at the monitors or the medical equipment. She didn't check vital signs or follow any medical procedure. She simply reached out her weathered hand and placed her palm gently on Lily's forehead. The moment her skin made contact with the child's cold skin, light bloomed. It wasn't the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital or the glow of the monitors. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Where Grace's hand touched Lily's forehead, a mark appeared, luminous and pure, like a star captured in human flesh. The light pulsed once, and in that pulse, everyone in the room felt something. It was a sensation beyond description, beyond the merely physical. It was like standing in warm sunlight after a long winter, like the relief of a fever breaking, like the first breath after nearly drowning. It was hope made tangible. The pulse of light traveled from Grace's hand through Lily's body, visible beneath her skin as it flowed. It moved down her face, through her neck, into her chest, branching out to her arms and legs like a river of radiance, flowing through a network of channels. Wherever it went, color followed. The deathly pallor that had overtaken Lily's skin faded, replaced by the healthy pink of living flesh. The flatline on the heart monitor erupted into activity, but it wasn't the erratic, failing rhythm that had been there before. It was strong and steady and vital, the heartbeat of a healthy child. Other monitors began to change. Oxygen saturation rose, blood pressure normalized, brain activity, which had been declining, surged, and then Lily's eyes opened. They weren't the clouded, confused eyes of someone barely conscious. They were clear and bright and fully aware. She looked up at Grace, who was smiling down at her with infinite gentleness. The mark of light on Lily's forehead pulsed one more time, then faded, leaving no trace on her skin. But the healing was complete and undeniable. The medical team stood frozen in stunned silence. Dr. Brennan stared at the monitors in disbelief, his hand still raised to check his watch. The numbers he was seeing were impossible. You couldn't go from complete cardiac arrest to perfect vital signs in seconds. You couldn't reverse multi-organ failure with a touch. It violated everything he knew about medicine, about biology, about the fundamental laws of how bodies worked. He stammered. I don't. What just happened? Lily's voice, weak but clear, broke the silence. Mommy! Sarah's scream was one of pure joy. She lunged forward, gathering her daughter into her arms, sobbing so hard she couldn't form words. Mark stumbled to the bed, his legs barely supporting him, and wrapped his arms around both his wife and daughter, his face pressed against Lily's hair as he repeated, "Thank God," over and over like a mantra. Grace quietly stepped back from the bed, her task complete. She moved toward the door with that same unhurried grace she had always displayed. Dr. Brennan, finally shaking off his shock, turned to speak to her, to ask what she had done, to demand an explanation for the impossible thing he had just witnessed. But she was already gone. The door was closing behind her, and when he rushed into the hallway to find her, it was empty. The nurse's station reported that no one had passed by. The security cameras, when they were checked later, showed Grace entering the room but never leaving. In the days that followed, Lily's recovery defied every medical explanation. Within hours, her organ function had returned to completely normal ranges. The infections that had been ravaging her body were gone, as if they had never existed. The leukemia that had been slowly killing her for 6 months had vanished. Every test came back normal. Every scan showed healthy tissue where there should have been damage. Dr. Brennan and his team ran every test multiple times, certain there had to be some mistake. They published papers on Lily's case, calling it a spontaneous remission of unprecedented speed and completeness. They used terms like misdiagnosis and miraculous recovery, and 1 in a billion spontaneous healing, but none of those phrases captured the truth of what had happened, because Mark and Sarah knew. They had been there. They had seen the light. They had watched their daughter die and then watched her live again through the touch of a humble nurse who had appeared in their darkest hour. They searched for Grace everywhere. They asked every nurse, every doctor, every staff member at St. Catherine's. They described her appearance, her manner, her quiet presence. Some people remembered seeing an older nurse matching that description. Others had no memory of her at all. But when they asked to see employment records, to find a file or a photo ID or any official documentation that Nurse Grace had worked at the hospital, there was nothing. The Human Resources Department had no record of any employee by that name. The nursing supervisor swore that she personally knew every nurse on staff, and there was no Grace among them. Security badge records showed no one with that name entering or leaving the hospital. It was as if she had never existed, as if she had been a collective hallucination shared by everyone who had encountered her, except for one piece of evidence. A junior nurse named Michelle Chen, who had been in the room during those final moments, had been so overwhelmed by what was happening that she had pulled out her phone and taken a photo. She didn't know why she did it. It was against protocol, potentially a violation of patient privacy, but in that moment of impossible crisis, something had compelled her to capture what she was seeing. The photo was blurry, taken in haste with a shaking hand. It didn't clearly show Grace's face. The figure of the elderly nurse was partially obscured by other people in the frame, and the light, that glorious, impossible light, appeared in the photo only as a strange golden aura that suffused the entire image, bright enough to wash out details, but not quite bright enough to prove anything supernatural had occurred. But the photo did capture one undeniable thing. The exact moment Lily's eyes opened, you could see the monitor in the background changing from flatline to normal rhythm. You could see the shocked faces of the medical staff. You could see Mark and Sarah's expressions transforming from grief to wonder. And you could see Lily, unmistakably alive and aware, looking up at something just beyond the frame of the image. Michelle gave the Thompsons a copy of that photo. They had it professionally printed and framed, and it became the centerpiece of what would come next. Mark, who had built his career on cynicism and skepticism, found that foundation crumbling. He couldn't explain what had happened with logic or reason or investigative journalism. He couldn't debunk it or rationalize it away. He had been transformed by what he witnessed, by the undeniable reality of divine intervention in his daughter's life. 3 months after Lily's healing, Mark resigned from his position at the Tribune. His colleagues thought he was crazy. He was in line for a promotion, possibly even an editorial position. He was throwing away a prestigious career. But Mark didn't care about any of that anymore. He had seen what really mattered, and it wasn't breaking stories or winning journalism awards. Sarah and Mark had a long conversation about what they should do with their lives going forward. They had been given their daughter back, pulled from the very edge of death by a miracle they couldn't explain. What was the appropriate response to such a gift? How do you live a normal life after experiencing something that defies all understanding of how the world works? They decided they couldn't. They couldn't go back to ordinary existence, couldn't pretend that everything was the same. They had been changed, and that change demanded expression. Using their life savings, Mark and Sarah founded Lily's Light Foundation. The mission was simple but profound: to provide compassionate, non-medical support to families with children in hospice care. They recruited and trained volunteers who would serve as advocates of hope, people who would sit with grieving families, listen to their stories, offer their presence in the darkest hours, and embody the spirit of grace that they had experienced. The advocates weren't there to provide medical care or spiritual counseling, though they could help families access those resources if needed. They were simply there to be present, to witness, to care. They were trained in the art of compassionate listening, in how to offer comfort without platitudes, in how to hold space for grief without trying to fix it or minimize it. The Foundation's office was a small suite in a modest building downtown. On the wall behind the reception desk hung that blurry photo from the hospital, framed and mounted with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Grace, whose touch brought light." Visitors would sometimes ask about the photo, about the strange golden aura that filled it, about the story behind its taking, and Mark or Sarah would tell them, not the sanitized version or the explanation that made skeptics comfortable. They would tell the full truth. Their daughter had died, and a nurse they couldn't identify and couldn't find had brought her back to life with a touch and a mark of holy light. They told it plainly, not caring if people believed them or not. It was their truth, their testimony, the foundation on which they were building something meaningful. Lily, now 8 years old and completely healthy, would sometimes come to the Foundation office after school. She would do her homework at one of the desks, surrounded by volunteers preparing for their hospital visits. She had no memory of the events in the hospital room, no recollection of dying or being healed, but she knew the story, had heard it many times, and understood that something extraordinary had happened to her. She drew pictures for the families served by the Foundation, bright and colorful images of hope and healing. She would include little notes: "You are brave and don't give up, and miracles happen." These small gestures from a child who had been saved became treasures for parents walking through their own valleys of shadow. The Foundation grew slowly but steadily. Word spread through hospital networks, through support groups, through chaplains and social workers who saw the unique value of what the advocates offered. The volunteers came from all walks of life: retired teachers, former nurses, stay-at-home parents, people who had lost their own children and wanted to turn their grief into service, people who had been helped in their darkest hours and wanted to pay it forward. Each advocate was trained in Grace's philosophy, though of course they called it the Foundation's philosophy. Be present, listen completely, offer comfort through your mere presence. Don't try to fix the unfixable or explain the inexplicable. Don't offer empty religious platitudes or false hope. Simply be there, be human, be compassionate. The stories that came back from the advocates were remarkable. Families who had been drowning in isolation found community. Parents who had been too numb to cry found permission to grieve. Children facing the impossible learned they weren't alone. And while there were no more miraculous healings, no more marks of light or impossible recoveries, there was healing of a different sort. There was the healing of knowing you weren't facing the darkness alone. One advocate, a woman named Patricia, who had lost her own son to cancer 5 years earlier, told Mark and Sarah about sitting with a father whose teenage daughter was dying. The man had been angry, hostile, rejecting all comfort. He had been, Patricia recognized, exactly where Mark had been in that hospital room. So she had simply sat with him in silence for an hour, not trying to talk him out of his rage, not offering advice or comfort, just being present in his pain. At the end of that hour, the father had said, "Thank you for not trying to make this better. Thank you for just being here." It wasn't a miracle in the supernatural sense, but it was a form of grace, and that's what the Foundation was learning to offer. Dr. Brennan, the physician who had declared Lily's case hopeless, became an unexpected ally of the Foundation. He was a man of science, trained to trust in evidence and empirical data. But he had been in that room. He had seen what he had seen, and no amount of rationalization could explain it away. He began referring families to Lily's Light Foundation, recognizing that medicine could treat the body, but sometimes fell short in addressing the suffering of the soul. He met with Mark over coffee one afternoon, 6 months after Lily's healing. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Dr. Brennan said, stirring his cup absently. "I've seen remissions that defied the odds. I've seen people pull through when all the indicators said they shouldn't, but I've never seen anything like what happened with your daughter. I can't explain it. I can't replicate it. I can't even properly document it without sounding like I've lost my mind." Mark nodded. "I know. I was a journalist. I built my career on facts and evidence. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have dismissed it as wishful thinking or religious delusion. But I was there. I saw my daughter die. I watched her come back. And now I live in a world where I know that miracles are real even if I can't explain them." "Does that bother you?" Dr. Brennan asked. "Living with something you can't explain?" Mark considered the question carefully. "It used to bother me. I used to think that if something was real, it had to be explainable. But now I think I had it backwards. Reality is bigger than our explanations. Our inability to understand something doesn't make it less true. It just makes us more humble." Dr. Brennan smiled sadly. "I wish more of my patients got the ending your daughter did. I wish I could call on Nurse Grace for every child I lose. But she only came that one time, for your family." "Why do you think that is?" It was a question Mark and Sarah had wrestled with many times. Why had they been chosen? What made Lily special? Why did other children, equally innocent and equally loved, die while Lily lived? It seemed cosmically unfair, and they had spent many sleepless nights trying to make sense of it. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "I used to think everything happened for a reason, that there was some grand plan. Then I stopped believing in any plan at all. Now I think maybe both those views were too simple. Maybe grace comes when it comes, not because we earn it or deserve it, but because that's the nature of grace. It's unearned, unexpected, and our job isn't to understand why we received it, but to honor it by living differently because of it." Sarah had her own theory, which she shared with the support group she sometimes spoke to. "I think grace came because we invited her in," she would say. "Not literally, though I did ask her to stay in the room. But I mean we opened ourselves to the possibility of something beyond what the doctors were telling us. Even in our darkest moment, we didn't completely close the door on hope. And maybe that tiny crack was enough for light to get through." Lily's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, watched the girl's transformation with quiet amazement. Lily had returned to school 3 months after the healing, and while her body was completely healthy, she had changed in subtle ways. She was gentler somehow, more aware of other people's feelings. When a classmate's parent died, Lily was the first to reach out, sitting with the grieving child during lunch, not trying to cheer her up, but simply being present. "She has an old soul now," Mrs. Rodriguez told Sarah during a parent-teacher conference. "I don't know how else to describe it. She's still a child, still plays and laughs and has fun, but there's a depth to her that wasn't there before. Or maybe it was always there, and now we can see it, because she came so close to the edge." Sarah thought about that observation often. What had Lily experienced in those moments between death and life? She had no memory of it, no recollection of tunnels of light or meetings with deceased relatives, none of the typical near-death experience phenomena. But something had changed in her at a fundamental level. She was more compassionate, more aware of suffering in others, more willing to offer comfort even when she couldn't fix the problem. One evening, as Sarah was tucking Lily into bed, her daughter asked a question that caught her off guard. "Mummy, do you think I was supposed to die?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" Lily's face was serious in the dim light of her bedroom. "I heard you and Daddy talking to people about what happened, about how the doctors said I was going to die, about the nurse who made me better. I don't remember any of it, but I wonder sometimes if maybe I was supposed to die and someone changed it. And if that's true, I wonder why." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know if we were supposed to live or die, honey. I don't think life works like that, with a fixed script we have to follow. I think the doctors looked at your body and saw that it was failing, and they were right about what they saw. But they couldn't see everything. They couldn't see the part of you that wasn't just your body. And I think Grace, whoever she really was, saw that part. She saw something in you worth saving, worth healing." "Do you think she was an angel?" Lily asked. "Maybe," Sarah said honestly. "Or maybe she was just a person who had learned how to let divine grace work through her. I don't think it matters what category we put her in. What matters is that she came when we needed her most, and now we try to be like her for other people." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "I want to be like her when I grow up. I want to help people who are sick and scared." "Then that's what you'll do," Sarah said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You'll find your own way to be grace for others." As the first anniversary of Lily's healing approached, the foundation planned a small ceremony. Not a celebration exactly, because they were acutely aware that not every family got the miracle they had received, but a remembrance, an acknowledgement of what had happened and what it had inspired. They invited the volunteers, the families they had served, Dr. Brennan and some of the nursing staff from St. Catherine's who had been in the room that morning. They met in a small community center, decorated simply with white flowers and candles. Mark stood at the front of the room to speak, Lily sitting in the front row between Sarah and her grandmother. He had prepared remarks, written and rewritten them a dozen times, but when the moment came, he set aside his notes and spoke from the heart. "A year ago," he began, "I was a man who believed only in what I could see and prove. I trusted in science, in medicine, in human expertise. And when those things told me my daughter was going to die, I accepted it because I thought that was reality. I was angry about it, devastated by it, but I accepted it as the truth." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. But then something happened that shouldn't have been possible. A nurse whose name we don't know, whose face we can barely remember, whose existence we can't prove, touched my dying daughter. And light happened, healing happened, a miracle happened. And I had to completely rebuild my understanding of what's real and what's possible. He looked around the room at the faces watching him. This foundation exists because we learned that medicine and science, as wonderful as they are, don't have all the answers. They can treat the body, but they can't always heal the soul. They can extend life, but they can't always give meaning to that life. What Grace taught us in that brief encounter was that presence matters, compassion matters. Being willing to stand with someone in their darkest hour, even when you can't fix anything, matters. Sarah joined him at the front, taking his hand. "We can't promise miracles," she said. "We can't bring back the children who have been lost. We can't heal every sickness or prevent every death, but we can be present. We can be grace for each other, in whatever small ways we're capable of. We can make sure that no family has to face the darkness completely alone." One of the advocates, a man named James who had lost his daughter to a brain tumor 3 years earlier, stood to speak. "I came to this foundation broken," he said. "I was angry at God, angry at the world, angry at myself for not being able to save my little girl. I heard about Lily's story, and honestly at first it made me more angry. Why did she get saved and not my daughter? What made her special?" He smiled sadly. "But working with this foundation, being present for other families, I've learned something. Grace isn't about fairness or deserving. It comes when it comes, where it comes. My daughter didn't get a miraculous healing, but I've been healed in a different way, by being allowed to turn my grief into service, my loss into love for others who are suffering. That's a kind of grace, too." After the ceremony, people mingled, sharing stories and coffee and quiet fellowship. Dr. Brennan found himself in conversation with Michelle Chen, the nurse who had taken the photo. She had brought another print of it, professionally enhanced to bring out details that had been obscured in the original. "I've looked at this image 1,000 times, Michelle said, showing him the enhancement. "I've tried to convince myself there's a rational explanation, camera malfunction, light refraction, something, but I can't explain away what I saw with my own eyes. I watched that child die. I watched her come back. I saw the light." Dr. Brennan studied the enhanced photo. With the improvements, you could see more details of the room, of the people present. And there, partially obscured by other figures but unmistakable, was an elderly woman in nursing scrubs, her hand extended toward the child. The golden aura in the photo seemed to emanate from that exact point of contact. "Do you ever wonder if we'll see her again?" Michelle asked. "If Grace, whoever she was, might appear again for another family." "I used to hope for that," Dr. Brennan admitted. "Every time I have a patient who isn't responding to treatment, every time I have to tell parents their child is dying, part of me looks around hoping to see that elderly nurse appear. But she hasn't come back, not in any case I've been involved with, and I've stopped expecting her to." "Does that make you sad?" Michelle asked. "It did at first," he said, "but now I think I understand better. She didn't come to start a pattern or establish a procedure. She came for that one family, in that one moment, for reasons we may never understand. And instead of wishing she'd come again, maybe our job is to learn from what she taught us, to be the kind of presence for our patients that she was for the Thompsons. We can't perform miracles, but we can offer grace in the form of compassion, presence, and hope." As evening fell and people began to leave the gathering, Lily found herself looking at the framed photo that had been set up on a display easel. She stood before it for a long time, studying the image of herself in that hospital bed, surrounded by people, bathed in inexplicable light. An older woman, one of the Foundation's volunteers, came to stand beside her. "Do you remember any of it?" she asked gently. Lily shook her head. "No. Everyone tells me what happened, but I don't remember. Sometimes I think I should remember something so important, but it's just blank." "Maybe that's a gift," the woman said. "You get to live your life forward, not haunted by the past. You know you were saved. You know you were loved enough that someone intervened, but you don't have to carry the weight of the actual experience." "Do you think she was real?" Lily asked. "The nurse, Grace." The woman smiled. "I think the most real things in life are often the hardest to prove. Love is real, even though you can't measure it. Hope is real, even though you can't see it. Grace is real, whether it comes in the form of a mysterious nurse, or a kind word from a stranger, or a moment of unexpected peace. It's all real, sweetie. More real than the things we can touch and count." Over the following years, Lily's Light Foundation continued to grow. They expanded to serve multiple hospitals in the region. They trained hundreds of advocates. They touched thousands of families walking through the valley of their children's terminal illnesses. They couldn't offer miracles, but they offered presence, and sometimes that made all the difference. Mark wrote a book about their experience, titled Grace in the Darkness. It became a modest bestseller, not because it promised easy answers or guaranteed miracles, but because it told an honest story about facing the impossible and finding hope in the most unexpected places. He donated all the proceeds to the foundation. Sarah returned to teaching, but now she taught art therapy to children in hospitals. She would sit with young patients and help them express through colors and shapes what they couldn't say with words. She taught them that beauty could be found even in suffering, that creativity could be an act of defiance against despair. Lily grew up with the story of her healing as part of her identity, but not the entirety of it. She was a good student, a talented artist like her mother, a compassionate friend. She volunteered at the Foundation's office, answering phones and helping organize events. She spoke sometimes at fundraisers, telling her story not to glorify herself, but to give hope to others. When she was 16, Lily was asked to speak at a medical conference about pediatric terminal care. Standing before a room full of doctors and nurses, she told them her story, showing that same blurry photo that had been shown so many times before. "I don't remember dying," she said. "I don't remember being healed, but I've lived with the effects of both for my entire conscious life. The doctors here tonight need to understand something important. You're not God. You can't save everyone. You can't perform miracles on command. And that's okay. That's not a failure on your part. It's just the reality of being human." She paused, looking out at the medical professionals listening intently. "But here's what you can do. You can be present. You can be honest. You can be compassionate. When you tell a family there's no hope, you can still offer them your humanity. You can make sure they know their child's life mattered, that they're not alone, that someone cares. That's not nothing. That's actually everything." Her words resonated deeply with the medical professionals present. Many of them approached her afterward, some with tears in their eyes, thanking her for reminding them why they had gone into medicine in the first place. It wasn't just to cure disease or extend life. It was to care for people in their most vulnerable moments. Dr. Brennan, now in his 60s and considering retirement, heard Lily's speech and felt something shift in his understanding. He had spent years trying to explain or rationalize what had happened in that hospital room. He had written papers, consulted with colleagues, explored every possible medical explanation. But perhaps he had been asking the wrong questions. The question wasn't, how did this miracle happen? The question was, what does this miracle teach us about how we should live and practice medicine? He began incorporating the philosophy of Lily's Light Foundation into his own practice. When he had to deliver terrible news to families, he didn't just present the medical facts and walk away. He sat with them. He listened to their stories. He acknowledged their pain. He made sure they knew that even when medicine couldn't save their child, they weren't facing the darkness alone. His colleagues noticed the change in him. Some thought he had gone soft, become too emotionally involved. But his patients and their families felt the difference. They sent letters thanking him not just for his medical expertise, but for his compassion, for treating their children not as cases, but as precious individuals worthy of dignity and care. One winter evening, nearly 10 years after Lily's healing, Dr. Brennan was working late at the hospital. He was exhausted, having just lost a patient, a 5-year-old boy who had fought cancer for 2 years. He sat in his office, head in his hands, wondering as he often did why some children lived and others died, why miracles came for some and not for others. There was a soft knock on his door. He looked up to see an elderly woman in nursing scrubs standing in his doorway. For just a moment, his heart leaped with impossible hope, but as his eyes focused, he realized this wasn't Grace. This was Martha, a nurse who had worked at the hospital for decades. "I heard about Tommy," Martha said gently, referring to the boy who had just passed. "I know it's hard. Are you okay?" Dr. Brennan found himself being honest in a way he rarely was with colleagues. "I don't know. I keep wondering why I couldn't save him, why we don't get more miracles, why Grace only came that one time." Martha moved into the office and sat down across from him. "I've been thinking about that story for years," she said, "about Nurse Grace and the Thompson girl, and I think maybe we've been looking at it wrong." "What do you mean?" Dr. Brennan asked. "We keep thinking Grace was special because she performed a miracle, but what if the miracle wasn't the point? What if the point was to show us that presence and compassion matter, that even in the face of death, how we treat people makes a difference? Grace didn't appear again because she didn't need to. She already taught us what we needed to know. Now it's up to us to be grace for each other." Dr. Brennan sat back in his chair, letting those words sink in. "So you're saying every nurse, every doctor, every person who shows up with compassion and presence is being grace?" "Exactly," Martha said. "The miracle of the light and the healing, that was a one-time thing to get our attention, to wake us up. But the real miracle is what happens every day when we choose to be present for each other, to offer comfort, even when we can't offer cure. That's a miracle we can all participate in." It was a profound shift in perspective, and it changed how Dr. Brennan understood his role. He wasn't supposed to be Grace, performing impossible healings. He was supposed to be himself, fully present, fully human, fully compassionate. And in being that, he was offering a form of grace that was accessible and repeatable. As Lily approached adulthood, she began to think seriously about her future. She had been accepted to several prestigious universities. She had considered becoming a doctor, following in Dr. Brennan's footsteps. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized her calling was different. She decided to study social work with a focus on family counseling in medical settings. She wanted to formalize and expand what the foundation had been doing, to create a professional framework for the kind of compassionate presence that Grace had embodied. "I can't heal people with a touch," she told her parents as they discussed her decision. "I don't have supernatural powers, but I can learn how to be present for people in crisis. I can learn how to hold space for grief and hope at the same time. I can learn how to be grace in a human, sustainable way." Mark and Sarah were proud beyond words. Their daughter, who had been saved by a miracle, was dedicating her life to being a miracle for others in whatever small human ways she could. On the 10th anniversary of Lily's healing, the foundation held a larger celebration. They had grown to serve 12 hospitals across 3 states. They had trained over 500 advocates. They had provided support to more than 3,000 families. The work continued to expand, reaching more people in need. But at the heart of it all was still that one story, that one impossible moment when death was reversed and light bloomed in a hospital room. They told the story again that night, not because it promised that everyone would get the same miracle, but because it reminded everyone present that the impossible sometimes happens, that hope is never completely foolish, that grace exists even if we can't explain or predict it. Lily, now 17 and preparing to start college, stood before the gathering and shared her perspective. "I'm the person this miracle happened to," she said, "but in some ways I'm the person who knows the least about it. I don't remember the experience. I can't tell you what it felt like to be touched by divine grace in that literal, physical way." She looked out at the faces watching her, faces of volunteers and families, doctors and nurses, people who had been touched by the Foundation's work. "But I know what it feels like to be surrounded by grace every day of my life. I know what it's like to have parents who turned their trauma into service. I know what it's like to be part of a community that believes in presence and compassion. I know what it's like to see people showing up for each other in the darkest moments. That's grace too, and it's a grace we can all give and receive." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Sarah found herself alone in the Foundation's office, standing before that framed photograph. She had looked at this image countless times over the years. She had studied every detail, searching for clues about who Grace really was, where she had come from, where she had gone. But tonight, standing in the quiet office, she realized she had been asking the wrong questions. It didn't matter who Grace was in a biographical sense. What mattered was what grace represented, the possibility of hope when all seems lost, the reality that we are not alone in our darkest hours, the truth that sometimes help comes from unexpected sources in unexpected ways. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to the figure in the photograph, to the mysterious presence who had saved her daughter and changed their lives forever. "Thank you for coming when we needed you. Thank you for teaching us what matters. Thank you for showing us how to live." The office was silent except for the hum of the heating system and the distant sounds of the city outside. But in that silence, Sarah felt something she had learned to recognize over the years, a sense of peace, of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. This was the legacy of grace, not just one impossible healing, but a ripple effect of compassion that spread out from that moment, touching thousands of lives. Every advocate trained by the foundation was carrying on Grace's work. Every family comforted in their grief was receiving an echo of what the Thompsons had received. Every doctor or nurse who learned to be fully present with their patients was embodying the same spirit that had filled that hospital room 10 years ago. Mark joined Sarah in the office, putting his arm around her shoulders as they both stood before the photograph. "Do you ever wonder if we'll see her again?" he asked, echoing the question that Michelle Chen had asked Dr. Brennan years earlier. Sarah thought about it for a moment before answering. "I used to hope for that. I used to imagine she'd appear again, maybe to heal someone else, maybe just to let us thank her properly. But now I think I understand that she doesn't need to come back. She's already here, in every act of compassion, in every moment of presence, in every choice to bring light into darkness. We're all grace now, or we can be if we choose to be." It was a profound truth, and it captured the essence of everything the foundation stood for. The miracle wasn't just about one child being healed. It was about all of us learning to be healers in whatever ways we can, to be present for each other, to offer grace even when we can't offer cure. As they locked up the office and headed home to where Lily was waiting, Mark thought about how far they had come from that terrible night in the hospital. They had been broken people, facing the worst thing that can happen to a parent. They had been saved by a miracle they couldn't explain, and they had turned that miracle into a movement, a way of being in the world that honored the gift they had received. The story of Nurse Grace and the dying girl who lived continued to spread. It was shared in medical schools as a reminder to treat patients with compassion. It was told in churches as evidence of divine intervention. It was discussed in families as a story of hope against all odds. And each telling, each sharing was another ripple spreading out from that central moment of miraculous grace. Years continued to pass. Lily graduated from college with honors and began her career as a medical social worker. She was exceptional at her job, able to connect with families in crisis, with an empathy and understanding that seemed to come from a deep well of personal experience. She couldn't remember her own brush with death, but somehow she carried the wisdom of it in her bones. She married a kind man named David, a pediatric nurse who shared her commitment to compassionate care. They had children of their own, 2 daughters who grew up hearing the story of how their mother had been saved by a mysterious nurse and how that experience had shaped their family's entire purpose. Mark and Sarah grew older gracefully, continuing their work with the foundation even as they transitioned into more advisory roles. They watched with pride as Lily and a new generation of leaders took the foundation forward, expanding its reach and deepening its impact. Dr. Brennan eventually retired from active practice, but stayed involved with the foundation as a medical advisor. He gave lectures at medical schools about the importance of compassionate presence in patient care. He had become, in his later years, a kind of prophet for a more humanistic approach to medicine, one that recognized the limits of scientific intervention and the unlimited potential of simple human kindness. And through it all, that photograph remained on the wall of the Foundation's office, a tangible reminder of the moment when everything changed. Visitors would sometimes stand before it, studying the blurred images, trying to make out the details of the mysterious nurse. Some saw what they wanted to see, definite proof of divine intervention. Others saw what they could accept, an inexplicable medical recovery captured in a moment of light and shadow. But everyone who looked at that photograph felt something, hope, perhaps, wonder, a sense that the world contains more mystery and possibility than our everyday experience suggests, a reminder that in our darkest hours, grace can appear in the most unexpected forms. This is the story of Grace, the humble nurse whose touch brought light and life to a dying child. But more than that, it's the story of how one miracle inspired thousands of small acts of grace, How one moment of divine intervention taught us all to be more present, more compassionate, more fully human with each other. The doctors had said there was no hope. They were wrong, but not because they were bad doctors or because they didn't know their science. They were wrong because hope isn't something that can be measured in lab results or predicted by medical models. Hope exists in a realm beyond diagnosis and prognosis. Hope is the territory of the soul, and sometimes, just sometimes, hope becomes manifest in ways that defy all explanation. We may never know who Grace really was. We may never understand why she appeared for the Thompsons and not for the thousands of other families facing similar grief. We may never be able to replicate or predict the kind of miracle that happened in that hospital room, but we don't need to understand everything to learn from what happened. What we learned is this: presence matters. Compassion matters. Being willing to sit with someone in their darkness, even when you can't fix anything, matters more than we realize. The greatest light, as Grace herself said, is sometimes found in the deepest darkness. Not because darkness is good, but because only in darkness can we truly appreciate any light at all. And so the work continues. The foundation grows. The advocates go out to hospitals and homes, offering their presence to families in crisis. The ripples spread from that one moment of miraculous intervention, touching more lives than can be counted. Grace came once, in a physical form that could place a hand on a dying child's forehead and bring forth light and healing. But Grace continues to come every day, in every act of compassion, in every moment of presence, in every choice to bring hope to the hopeless and comfort to the grieving. This is not a story with a neat ending, because the story is still being written. It's being written every time an advocate sits with a grieving parent. It's being written every time a doctor chooses to really listen to a patient's fears. It's being written every time any of us chooses to be fully present for another person in their moment of need. The mark of light that appeared on Lily's forehead has long since faded, leaving no physical trace. But its effects continue to ripple outward, touching lives, changing hearts, reminding us all that miracles don't always come with thunder and trumpets. Sometimes they come in the quiet touch of a humble person who shows up when they're needed most. So I ask you now, as we come to the close of this story, what would you do when faced with impossible darkness? Would you give up hope entirely? Would you cling to faith against all reason? Would you be willing to invite grace in, even if you don't fully understand what that means? The Thompson family made a choice in their darkest hour. They chose to remain open to possibility. They chose to invite presence and compassion into their grief. And that choice, as much as the miracle that followed, changed everything. Take a moment right now and drop a comment below. Tell me your thoughts on this story. Tell me about a time when grace appeared in your life, in whatever form it took. Let me know what city you're watching from. And if this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you that hope is never completely foolish and miracles can happen in the quietest moments, then subscribe to this channel. Share this message with someone who needs to hear it, because every share, every comment, every act of spreading hope is its own small miracle. The work of grace continues, and you can be part of it, not by performing supernatural healings, but by being present, by being compassionate, by being willing to stand with others in their darkness and offer whatever light you can. That's the real miracle. That's the real legacy of the humble nurse who appeared when hope seemed lost and proved that sometimes, just sometimes, love is stronger than death and grace is more powerful than despair. Thank you for listening to this story. May you find your own moments of grace, and may you have the courage to be grace for others when they need it most.